It's like the health we have now is a result of the decisions we made in the past. It's like a really some practical human level. And the body and the planet that we'll have in a decade or 2 decades or 3 decades is going to be a consequence of our healthy lifestyle options now.
Hey, how are you?
Oh, I'm good, Peter. Amazing to be here with you.
Yeah, and it's amazing to have you. Thank you so much. So, like most of these podcasts, I do like to start with a little bit more of a background into the guest and like your why. So maybe start in just describing kind of a little bit about you, your background, and why you do the work that you do today.
Oh, talk about one of those wonderful open-ended questions for one's entire life. So I'm going to actually start way back, in part because people often hear my accent and that usually get like going, wait a second, where's that accent from? And so they're listening to the accent instead of everything else. So I was born in Australia and then did what any smart child does when your father, who's a PhD student, graduates and gets his PhD. He went where he could get work, which is a very smart idea for a man with a wife and 2 small daughters. And so at 2.5, we moved from Australia in the middle of summer to Canada in the middle of winter, which I think must have been a little bit of a culture shock. My dad was an agricultural economist, so I remember him talking all sorts of things, agriculture, and as a little kid in the garden, we'd get far more information about stuff than I think we probably wanted. Whereas my mum was one of these women who, I should say is, because she's still around, who was just, she had this, in Canada, we had the downstairs part, which was sort of where the boiler room was, which would keep the winter chill off. And next to that space was my idea of complete coziness. A, it was warm, and B, it was where she had all her craft and making space. So she would make all sorts of amazing things. So that was my favorite hidey hole as a kid. And when I was 7, we moved from Canada and went to Nigeria just after the Biafran War, which I think, as a kid, it meant absolutely nothing to me. But now, having read a bit more of that history, I kind of realized my parents were really stepping off a very known world into a world where we didn't know, but they believed that by going to the International Institute of Tropical Agriculture, it takes practice to be able to say all those syllables in one go. IITA is what I used to say as a kid. I think I must have been much more grown up before I tried to even ever say the entire thing. Was the institutes were being set up to create the Green Revolution, because in the 50s and 60s, one of the things that was creating challenges in the world was frankly starvation, and starving people, would go fight, and it was a big reason why wars had been fought. So a group of organizations and countries decided they want to do something about that and started investing in research to go, how can we produce better food, more food that's appropriate to these different parts of the world, so we don't have wars fought for hunger. So that got us to Nigeria just after the Biafran War, which was one of those horrible civil wars where we'd see kids on the street who would have those swollen bellies that would come from literally being malnourished, not having enough to eat. It was, as a kid, it was sort of normal but different. And as an adult, I realized just really how horrible it must have been for people living there to have food so short. And then we got sent off to boarding school in England and France because there weren't many schools near where we were. So every now and again, you'll see a little English accent popping out. And it's not just because I'm imitating you, it's because I was school as a kid. And then we moved to Nigeria to the International Rice Research Institute, which was where I was 12 by then. So I packed a lot in my first little years. But I think when I look at it, one of the things I gained out of that was the space of my parents' choices meant that I saw a huge amount of the world really young. But I also saw how people, if they really believed in something, could get together with other people and actually truly over time make huge differences. So it was a pretty amazing way of growing up.
Yeah, exactly. And when we talk about like belief and when people get together, they can do great things. That kind of brings me a little bit more towards the work that you do today, and like the book that you've just had released.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Okay. So Greensight, the sustainability guide for company directors, released in June 2022, which feels kind of exciting. So what happened for me was I went to high school, went to university, and did business. And when I hit the business world, it didn't really want to talk about sustainability or any of these things. And even the word ethics was considered an optional kind of idea. And I remember talking to my dad about this because this was the world I'd grown up in. And he was just sent me a book that was from Harvard Business Review, who honestly, Peter, you can't believe it, but it pretty much said ethics didn't have a place in business. It was just appalling. It was like the only rationale in business was how much money you can make. The impact that has on other people wasn't your problem.
Yeah.
And that just didn't make sense for me because I'd seen you make a decision here and then you have people starving over there. It has a consequence. You make a decision here, you have people fed over here. It was just like, my brain didn't compute. But I was in the business world. So fast forward, a number of years, I end up running big businesses and still had this inkling in the back of the head that we could do an awful lot better in business. And so last year when COP26 came through, and it was the first time I'd say in my entire adult life, I'd seen business show up at the table with countries and saying, okay, we get it. We actually really need to do a lot differently. It wasn't just countries saying we need to do something about climate change and the way humanity is operating on the planet and the way we're using resources and wastage. Businesses and the big businesses were there going, okay, we get it. We're in this one too. And so I looked at it, and having had this interest from, way, way back, but also having done some things with the Alliance to End Plastic Waste and what they were trying to do in addressing this, realized that there are a couple of real challenges that business leaders face in this, is that there's a lot of very good environmental research or social research, but it's not necessarily written in a way that in business we can understand it. It's not written in our frame of reference. So that was part of it. If we don't understand, it's super hard to do anything. And then the second area was talking with a group of senior executives going like, we know we need to do something, but we can't get our organization behind it. And my business work had been about business transformation, which was about going, okay, well, what's the goal we want to get to? How do we align the organization of people to take action in that direction? So I decided to, put my professional money where my mouth was and actually go and create something that would be useful for senior leaders so that they could get a common language, understand it. I mean, at one level, really fundamental things, but without which you can't have a conversation and go, well, wait a second, what does this mean to our business? Where do we need to act? When people talk about ESG, it's like this alphabet soup. There's so many different acronyms in there. It's overwhelming. What does the E mean? Okay. So I'm thinking it means this, and then you're thinking it means that. So I identified 8 different elements of environment that are regularly talked around in this space. Another set in the social, in the S, the social, and then another set in the governance one that are all part and parcel of the ESG thing, so that as a leader, you can look at it and go, oh, we're paying attention to that. Oh, actually, you know what? I hadn't realized that we're not paying attention or as much attention as we could to that. So that then you could sit down as a business leader and say, okay, is it right that I'm an observer and just sitting on the side and observing this? Or is this actually really a valid place for our business to be here and now? Are we making a pledge because we see changes that some of our stakeholders want? So are we making statements, but we're not really taking action to change our business model? Yeah,
it's interesting because, one of the things that I took from your book that I really liked is just the statement that you say, a problem cannot be solved until it's understood, and sustainability is a defining challenge of our time. It's very much a defining challenge. The interesting point that I look at holistically is the fact how stakeholders are now taking the lead rather than just shareholders. So, that brings into the logic about neoliberalism under the ideology of Milton Friedman and the shift in paradigm, I would say, to more of a a shareholder vested economy where everybody has a central interest in the continuation of progression to allow some of the world's greatest challenges to be addressed. And one of the key elements about your book is drawing down the narratives that there are plenty, and it's confusing a lot of people at this moment in time. But largely, like purpose and the ESGs that form within purpose and sustainability and climate change, a lot of these wider implications lie within the why. Why are you doing this? Mm-hmm. The what are you trying to achieve? And the how are you going to actually action and take ownership of some of these global challenges?
Yeah. And like at a really pragmatic level, one of the things I realized was that you mentioned sort of, the Friedman and some of these other schools of economics. I mean, we've had 100-year experiment with businesses saying, if we only optimize for one stakeholder, will it create enough value for everybody else? Which was, the premises of, the rising tide theory. And what we're seeing is, well, it creates an awful lot of costs that other people are bearing. And the shift from a shareholder only to a stakeholder-based capitalism is a reflection of other theories of business that have been out there. And I think its time has really come in, because non-financial stakeholders are going, excuse me, like here's one for you, as on the purpose type conversation. Like, I find it a tough ask to say, I'm providing you a product that's poisoning you, and therefore you should pay me more because I stopped poisoning you.
Yeah, exactly.
This is like, excuse me? Because that's what people are in essence doing, is saying, oh, well, even if we're going to make it sustainable or not less environmentally damaging for this other environment over there, or less polluting and impacting future generations, you've got to pay for it. So I'm like, okay, so in other words, we're paying you less so you can poison us. There's something on the purpose point about why are we doing things. And I think in business, if we go back to why are we doing it? Yes, it's to make a profit. I get that. I've been in business a long time. It's also to do good. It's to provide service. And it's entirely possible to do it in a way that creates positive impact in far greater parts of what we're doing than to externalize costs on other people, be it the environment or other generations.
Yeah, and I think it's the cool thing about now is that largely global leaders are engaged, right? They're really interested in the fact that what could they do to help? How could they actually be part of the solution rather than the problem? And whilst this isn't the case in every single global leader, the vast majority are literally looking towards alleviating the world's global problems that we face at the moment. So looking at that, I'm looking at the likes of sustainability readiness. What could business owners be doing at this point in time within their own businesses if they wanted to kind of understand their own form of Greensight?
There's two really concrete things they can do right away. The first one is to just make a decision. And the decision is, are they going to commit to working out what it's going to take to do net zero or true zero regenerative, what I call really going green. So that's the net zero targets that are out there. True zero is taking it the next step further. It's saying we're not contributing any carbon. And then the regenerative is saying we're going to clean up the past. So we're going to clean out the damage that we've done in the past. So it's hence the regenerative phrase. So it's making the choice to make that commitment. And that's a significant step, because for a lot of business people, we're used to operating in a world where I need to know how I'm going to do it before I commit to it. And what's actually being asked is commit and then work it out. So the holding back from the diving in piece is a bit of a challenge. So the first one is just make the choice. I'm either going to be committing to one of these green elements, or I'm accepting and acknowledging I'm going to continue my business operations as is, which by definition is going to be contributing to what I call the rusty red world, which is 3 to 4 degrees or potentially higher average, which with all the negative consequences that we may have, say, in 10 years or 20 or 30 years. You look like you're a touch younger than me, which means you've probably got a few more of those decades. But I look at my life and I've got 4 to 5 decades ahead of me, so I'm quite aware that decisions that are made now are going to be ones that I'm going to live with for 50 years. That's one big one. And let's loop back to that that one, and because I want to just talk about the other action. It's actually really looking at our businesses with genuine open eyes and going, what world do I want this business to be creating? So I've got the pledge. So, and given that, is this something that's going to have is there demand for my stakeholders? So if you've got support from your stakeholders, of course, it's easier. If your stakeholders don't care, well, then they leave a different reason for doing it. But what stakeholders? Is it my customers? Is it my employees? Is it my suppliers? Is it, because some suppliers are refusing to supply to people now. Is it my financiers? Is it my investors? Is it my communities? There's that whole stakeholder one around. There could be things there. And then secondly, looking at how the world could be, is it going like, how will my business model need to change?
Exactly.
And what I'm finding is quite a few organizations, when they start looking at that, and they're going, well, you know what? There's a big shift on both accounts. Our stakeholders are asking a lot more, and our business models are going to have to change significantly.
Yeah, and there's a multitude of different reasons that's forcing these pressure forces upon business. We're coming out of the back end of the COVID pandemic. We're seeing the crisis in around like Russia and Ukraine, and without going into too much detail on that, there is a potential of global issues in respect to the distribution of wheat that comes out of Ukraine, and also how that if there is a blockade and a continued blockade, how down the line it will lead to starvation in Asia and Africa, and further afield it'll lead to the likes of a global refugee crisis. There's a lot of wide implications about what's taking place at this current point in time. And I think the key point that I always say to business leaders at the moment is we're in a period of education. You've got to be part of the conversation. You've got to be wide-eyed to what the global economy contains and is created from at this present point in time, because the old logic that we can kind of return to norm just doesn't make sense anymore, because the world has, over the last 2 years, has dramatically changed. So I think there's a lot of different forces. There's people, be that investors, be that external parties, from a consumer base. A lot of people are demanding change, and those companies that are failing to kind of step up to the mark are being kind of called out. And it's kind of quite volatile, really.
Well, it's volatile in a whole bunch of ways, and something that I'm certainly seeing with the businesses that I'm working with is that this time last year, maybe 25-35% of RFPs were asking for what people are doing around sustainability, some kind of indication of a position or a pledge. It's now up at 75%. I mean, that's in under a year. So there, from a point of view of customers on the finance side, particularly in the business, financial side, particularly in the business B2B world, this is showing up as a significant element already. The other one is, for people that are, because I know not all of your audience is business, so forgive me, people who are listening with us right now, for some of the business jargon that's happening here. I know each field has its terms, but what is also happening is that at long last, the finance industry, so insurance, banks, some of the big fund managers are consciously looking at where their money is going. And some people will be listening and saying about time too. And, I hear you on this one. But what I can say is I'm seeing it actually happen, not just the talk, but the actual happening. And what that's showing up as already, last year it was a 2% difference in the cost of funds. It's now up to 4%. So, if we're sitting there listening and thinking, going, well, what's a 4% difference on my interest rate? That's what we're talking about. It's a 4% differential interest rate that's showing up for people who don't have sustainability. So if you've got a less sustainable business model or business with these sorts of impacts that we've just been talking about, it could cost you 4% more for money. And that, for anyone who's paying a mortgage, like most of us as human beings, that's a pretty hefty cost. And so there's real practical financial value in taking action now. That cost difference is only going to get bigger.
Yeah, and I think there's also a lot more transparency, right? And it's not just accountability, there's an awful lot more transparency. So we had Circa 5000 on just the other day, and their business model is an investment platform that is focused on people and the planet. And they're literally trying to change the landscape of investments to allow for the investment in water, the investment in energy, and also allow for a conscious investor or anybody that's keen to understand where their money is actually going in respect to their savings, in some cases their pensions, etc. There's a lot more transparency. You can actually see the percentages and so on and so forth. So it's a really good platform. And I think also you've got a lot more metrics and indicators as well that's taken place. So we had a little while ago Strawberry Frog on, and they were talking about the Purpose Power Index. You've seen within the EU, they're talking about the changing of reporting to allow for more transparency and accountability and ownership in respect to businesses as well. Also, same goes over in America with some of the changes that's taken place there. I think where we are now, it's not just a case of a call to action that's coming from the consumers. It's also a call to action that's coming from investors, because people want to see a changed world a lot quicker than kind of some of the deadlines that were placed down in COP, for example. If you look at what happened with Modi, he extended his deadline by another 10 years. And you touched upon it just a little bit earlier. We're trying to create the future that A, we want to retire into, and B, that's going to be prosperous for future generations and sustainable for future generations.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like the health we have now is a result of the decisions we made in the past. It's like a really some practical human level. And the body and the planet that we'll have in a decade or 2 decades or 3 decades is going to be a consequence of our healthy lifestyle options now.
What would you say are like the key early decisions that business leaders could today, if they're wanting to make change today, if they're listening to this podcast and interested in actually exploring it further, what would be kind of some of the quick wins per se, based upon some of the knowledge from your book?
I think in some ways this is the lifestyle change thing. So it's not necessarily starting off with a radical lifestyle change, but it is acknowledging there's going to be some differences. So like the really practical starting place, once you've got past the decision. So I'm going to assume on the basis that everybody who's still here with us is going, yes, the net zero, true zero, regenerative, the green type way is the way to go. Because when you're in that one, you're thinking and looking for different sorts of places and solutions than if you're trying to put lipstick on a pig. or bandage something that's in a bad space. So what I found is that in this thing, it can feel so overwhelming because there's so many different places that one could start. And the mere fact I'm aware that I've said, well, ESG can be broken into 23 plus subcategories, and those categories are mounting. And then so what I did in the book was I broke it down into some practical ways where you can look at it and go, okay, let's start on this. So if we say that, maybe you're in a business where you go, you know what, we don't have access to change a lot of our carbon footprint. Our biggest thing is our energy usage, and the energy usage is the energy is produced by the local power company, and there's only so much we can do. Is go, okay, well, that's true. The 2 places I'll invite people to look at is saying, of the other parts that are about sustainability, so things like biodiversity, land use, nitrogen and phosphorus, and there's some of these other elements that are in there, are there things that we can take into action now? Because just because one area is something we don't do, our business is going to have impact on other areas. So pick one, pick something you can do something on, and deliberately challenge yourself to do something on it this quarter, to make a material difference in it this quarter. Because what I found is that when we start saying it's a long way away, it's easy to put it off for tomorrow. But if we say, okay, I want to go and tackle what our situation is this quarter and make a real change, and then speak to the entire organization and go, okay, this is the thing that we're going to look at this quarter. What are we going to do? Are we going to look at how we're using plastic and generate plastic? Is it waste? Is it plastic? Pick one of these things, because if each quarter you tackle something with real material vigor and you speak to other parts of your value chain, your customers and your customers' customers, because sometimes your impact is what's happening further away from you. You can make design decisions that can create an impact, or sometimes it's what you've asked your suppliers to do and how you're asking them to do things that's creating an impact. So it's about moving, not just about our own organization and in what we're doing here. It's about looking broader into the value chain side of things. So those would be two really powerful things. Is actually shifting, deliberately going, what is one that I can focus on this 90 days and I'm going to take a material action on? Because you do something this 90 days, you do something next 90 days, you'll make progress. You make serious progress doing 90-day cycles. And secondly, how can we go and look further up our value chain and further down our value chain and see other opportunities to partner and make changes?
Yeah, it's about, for me, I've often talked about proactive versus reactive, but it's about being proactive. What causes do you stand for? What do you want to remediate per se? Whilst others are often kind of torn into almost a reactive nature of each daily change event that is almost, some businesses are making a mistake by saying, oh, well, I need to respond to that. And then they invest time and effort to kind of respond to each like daily change and nuance. But ultimately, if you start kind of small to grow big, if you figure out a specific thing that you want to focus on, and that can be like the cause one, and then cause two comes about, and then cause three comes about. Yeah. Not only are you able to galvanize people internal to your business because they're really passionate about what you're trying to achieve and why, you're able to better engage with a very well adapted, wise, educated consumer base. And in respect to that, it kind of brings me to the topic of profitability, because so many businesses and leaders listen to podcasts like this and go, oh, well, it's really nice and whatever, but will I be able to turn a profit? And there's a huge evidence base behind that.
If someone listening it is a bit very, very business-minded, here's two very business-minded practical facts. Assuming that the concept of saving 4% on your interest didn't catch you with attention, is this one, is if you knew your business was going to be put out of business in 18 months because you weren't able to do something sustainably, would you make the change now? Some of the sustainability requirements are going to be regulatory and licensed to operate in the relatively near future. So there's a certain amount of, proactive preparation. But let's be a little bit more cheerful, because, that one's sort of a little bit, that's a little bit, sticky, So let's talk a little bit more clarity on this one. So I was involved in a call actually about 6 months ago, and the wonderful gentleman who was leading it, he asked a question of 36 of us in the room. He said, okay, so if you were standing outside a business or looking at a business online, so this would pretty much cover, all sorts of businesses, and they were identical. He used the economic word ceteris paribus, he was really geeking. And it's like, if they're absolutely identical, same price, same product, absolutely everything, same number of people using them, they were identical. But one organization actually had their impact and the good that they were doing in the world visible, and the other didn't. So it could be doing nothing, could be doing something, but it wasn't visible. Who would you buy from?
Everybody picks impact, right?
Absolutely. Everyone did. And this was a group that were, just for anyone who's listening and going, they were warm, fuzzy people. They were warm, fuzzy accountants. Okay.
They're always the hardest people to sell against.
So I'm just saying, so if a room full of accountants is making this call, which is exactly what happened, Peter, you were spot on in guessing in your intuition there. This is the reality. So the carrot here is identifying what you're doing, show it, and make it visible so that your people realize it. Because often there's many good things that are already done in our business, and we're not necessarily as aware of it. But also in doing that, you'll probably surface a bunch of other areas. You go, oh, actually, now we're looking at that. I had no idea. Or somebody who's down in shipping might be seeing a whole bunch of wastage coming in and packaging. That may be an opportunity for them to collaborate with the supplier to do something different about it. Because once you open the conversation up, and then that can start creating a virtuous cycle for impact. Yeah, but exactly. Being able to see and report your impact is huge.
Yeah, massively. And I think we'll only see more of it in respect to transparency, reporting and index and matrix and, the comparables between nations. We saw quite recently, like the work that South Korea have done recently in respect to their changing of recycled material. Like it's astronomical. I was watching something on the World Economic Forum, and they've gone from being one of the least nations for recycling to one of the best practice nations. So it's huge changes that can take place. But I think also one of the key to this change that we're articulating it's not just ownership from business, it's ownership from the individual, right? You talked about like finding opportunities within like shipping and packing, and individuals have to take ownership of suggesting to business and also changing their own individual practices and behavior in ways that are going to enrich them going forward. Because I think one of the key challenges to where we are at this present point in time is how well attuned people are to the topic of change. Historically, change has often been something that's been feared, but it's been feared because of a lack of education around the possibility for what that change allows going forward. So I think we have to also have people that are kind of keen to go on this developmental journey themselves, to educate themselves, to create a growth mindset, to kind of be the best versions of themselves, to galvanize and motivate others to do the same. And I think it's kind of has that knock-on effect, right? When one person does it and they see the impact, then another person does it and they see the impact, and it goes and goes and goes and goes. And before you know it, you're creating these like huge global communities of empowered people that are changing everything.
Yeah, I love it when we get into the space of talking about change, because I remember the days before we had these lovely devices. And for anyone who's not actually watching Peter and I, which you won't be able to because you're on a podcast, but I'm holding up my mobile phone, and no one forced me to get a mobile phone. I got it because it helped me. And I bring this into the conversation because there's a lot of story about change being something we fear. But also the thing is, change is something when it suits us and adds to our life, we go for it. We most of us picked up our mobile phones, except for my elderly uncle who is 89, who just has gone, no. He goes, I've lived 89 years quite happily without it. I'm not taking it on. But it's a conscious choice in his case. That said, he's actually is still wearing my grandfather's shirts. So he's kind of sustainable in another way. So, shout out to Uncle Robin. But, I'm saying this because when I go and look at little kids, and I know you've got, an absolute adorable youngster in there, they don't fear change. It's just like the whole world is this exciting place and they dive in. And so there's a bit, I kind of bring this in just because if we look at some of this as going, well, maybe it gives us more benefits. And if I look at it like the way a mobile phone brought something into my life, or I approach it with the inquiring spirit of a 2-year-old, I might find it easier to step into doing something that's a bit different, because a 2-year-old would be quite happy to, and they grow up and look at us here and now, big 2-year-olds.
Yeah, exactly. But if it's technology, right? Because it advances at such a pace far ahead of like human advancement naturally. So I think the fact is technology is also pushing where we're going to go and why. And I think there's not too much resistance. I think even when we speak to like the stakeholders and companies, etc., that we work with, the engagement, the interest is definitely there. I think what a lot of companies struggle on is the activation piece, the how. So I think when they were to look at books like yours, for example, there's a lot of like key knowledge and insight in there that would allow them to understand the how a little bit more in respect to their own businesses and practices. Because, we mentioned it earlier on, like a problem cannot be solved until it's understood. And I think that the 10-year problem, or the even further afield, like the 10 and 20-year question, like what does that world look like? And what can we be doing now to make sure that that world is something that isn't a world of chaos, but it's a world of opportunity?
Yeah. I mean, something that I come back to me when I'm sort of doing this and helps me keep a frame of reference is I look at this and I go, okay, so like right now it's 8 years till 2030. And 8 years can seem like a long time, but I remind myself when I decided to go to university, I knew that I'd had to do a 4-year degree. If I did economics and law, it's going to be 5 years. And then I'd probably have to do 2 foundation years before I was really anywhere. So I was signing up to a 7-year program. and we do, when we're going to university, we are in essence signing up, for a 7-year life program to get somewhere. And we do it and we're fine doing it. And the outcome of that kind of commitment is quite substantial. So I look at the remind myself that if we look at what we're doing now and saying, if we set a goal, say by 2030, this is the goal, and going, okay, so this year, if we maybe we haven't done a whole lot, we go, okay, so this year is the equivalent of my freshman year at university, where I'm going to be learning a whole bunch of new stuff. We're going to be getting foundation tools. We're going to be finding the other people we want to play and do things with, because no one makes this sustainability journey on their own. And then you find, oh, wait a second, you're doing that and it's really good. Oh, you mean you've solved that problem? Now I can learn from that. You know, the way we split stuff up at uni. I mean, and if we treat it with the same lightness of spirit, but the same discipline we have that got us through, that 7-year journey, each year we're changing the trajectory. And which is why when earlier on I said to do the 90-day ones, because if we take that year and then we break it down into semesters, and then that's into, the equivalent of like 4 sets of 90 days, just to use the business ones, it's manageable chunks to go, well, this is what we're going to get cracked this time.
Yeah, exactly. Because, I think we can change the trajectory of where we're going. You mentioned earlier about like the reductions in temperatures. Like we can change that now, but yeah, it's about actually planning and figuring out the achievable chunks in the, like I often talk about 30, 60 and 90 days. What would you do now, and like prioritize it, and how can you like put that into action, and what you're going to focus on, and how you're going to like ultimately turn around and assess the success of that particular implementation. I think where the solutions will lie is within, in my opinion, and I'd like to get your take on this, I think like the solutions lie within business, and it lays within people and community. I struggle to believe that some of the problems that we face now are going to be solved by government. And that is not necessarily about a critique on what the government are like at the moment globally and how they vary. I think it's more so in respect to how they act. So they're quite, their focus is on the short term, and it's on re-election. It's on the, the various different election cycles. And I think those like small 4-year windows, and especially where we are today with respect to global turbulence, I think the ownership is, and probably the leading lights are going to be organizations globally, and also people and community rather than kind of government. But what is your view? Do you think it's a business case, or do you think it's more something that the government are going to solve, or do you think it's more of a partnership approach between the two?
Well, I think it's partnership between the three, because either, we as human beings, starting off, because we as human beings, we show up as consumers, we show up as social society, we show up as how we vote, or, where we demonstrate, we show up as what we buy and what we do in our jobs, be it in government or in a business or in some other role. It's who we show up as people. And so the government can only act because we, the people, in a democratic frame, which is where we're both based. And business will act a lot faster when we, the people, are in doing this one, because we, the people, are the person who's walking in, and we're the chairman of the board. But the cool thing is, I think now to me, the big shift that's happened in the last 18 months, which I'm really, really excited by, is that business is now firmly seeing itself at the table. And it's not a single outlier business here, or somebody that's particularly values driven as a distinct thing there. It's becoming part of the collective meme of this is how we do business.
Yeah, exactly. And you're getting a lot of diverse viewpoints. So with that, you're getting a lot of new skills and knowledge and insight and innovation as well. So yeah, I know when we kind of dive into these, like I kind of quite focus on the detail, but largely when you look holistically at where we're going and the future ahead of us, like it is actually an amazing place to be. Like I can see where we're going, because I can see the changes that we're making now are going to be for the positive of people like 10, 20, 30 years down the line. Naturally, there's going to be some turbulence. Naturally, you're going to get a little bit of ups and downs in periods of change, but that's always been the case. Crisis is the catalyst for change. Like it's so where we are now is people have taken that moment of reflection during the pandemic. Their businesses are kind of starting up and running again. We're looking at the global economy in new ways. We're looking at potential paradigm shifts to new forms of ideologies and economic stances. The future is going to be amazing. It's just a case of the more people that can be part of the conversation, and the more people that can kind of take those moments, those stands, what they stand for, what causes they stand for and believe in, and actually go towards action and concentrate on the how. I think, that's how we're going to actually see the speed of progression to the place we need to be. Because that's what it's about at the end of the day. Yeah. How quickly we can get there, rather than it's what it looks like, because it's very evident what it looks like. It's about the speed of getting there.
Yeah, exactly. It's not about why. It's not about what. Now it's about movement, the doing.
Exactly.
It's like, okay, we know the mountain, we know what it looks like. Now we actually have to go and
do it. Yeah.
Do the walking.
Yeah, exactly. But I love talking to you, so I could talk to you for the rest of the day. But I just wanted to finish out by asking you, kind of, if you would like to leave a key takeaway, something you'd like to say to our audience, what would it be and why?
Okay. So earlier in this, I spoke about the idea of, are we committing to being a green business, the decisions that way, or are we just going to stay with status quo and kind of stay rusty red world? And what I realize when I'm working with leadership teams and boards, I take them to the point where it's this realization that every business decision we make, and actually you could say also every life decision, if you want to take it out of the business world, we make, is either one that's going to be contributing to green or it's rusty red. And so my final message would be is just this: take that moment whenever you're making a decision, is to go, is this decision one that's to go green or go red, go rusty red, and then pick the future you'd really prefer, take the action in that direction.
I love that. Thank you so much. That's an absolute great analogy. I'll be using that going forward. Thank you very much, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you for listening to the Purpose Made podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to Purpose Made wherever you normally get your podcasts to hear the latest news and views. You can also find and follow us on Instagram, LinkedIn and Twitter, or contact Peter directly to connect, inquire about Purpose Made, or request to be featured on the podcast. We look forward to welcoming you back soon for another episode.